Hi, I'm Randy Nelson. I'm the off-road technical trainer for Polaris Industries, and today we're going to install a winch on this 2017 Sportsman XP1000. Before we begin, we want to make sure to read the instructions in its entirety and make sure all parts and tools are accounted for. We also want to make sure we retain these instructions for future reference and parts ordering information. So let's get started with the installation. Before we begin, we want to ensure that the vehicle is in park and the ignition key is off with the key removed from the vehicle before we begin. So we're going to go ahead and open the front storage rack here. So we're going to unlatch the two rubber latches on either side. We're going to lift up the front rack, and then we're going to remove the front storage tray here. The front storage tray is removed with 2 quarter turns, one on either side. Go ahead and just give those a turn, and we'll go ahead and lift out the storage tray and remove that from the vehicle so we can get access to the battery and we can disconnect the cables. So we're going to go ahead and begin by disconnecting the battery. We always want to make sure we disconnect the ground cable first from the vehicle, then the positive cable. So I'm just using a 10mm socket, 1/4-inch drive to remove the bolt. We want to make sure that we hold on to the bolt and any backing washer on the bolt and not drop anything. Got that removed, and just as an added note, we want to ensure how many cables are coming off that ground stud. So in our case, we have 1 cable here. This is actually for a battery tender, and then we got the main chassis ground here that goes to the battery. So I'm just going to go ahead and reinstall the bolt back into the lug of the battery terminal, just so we don't lose it. And then we're going to go ahead and proceed to disconnect the positive side of the battery. And same thing here, just kind of note how many cables you're removing. We're removing 3 cables on the positive post here. 1 for the battery tender, and then 2 for the vehicle itself. So we're going to go ahead and remove the lower bumper cover. So we have 4 bolts that need to be removed from the vehicle. If your bumper is equipped with a front accessory brush guard, you're going to need to remove that now prior to removing this cover here. So we'll go ahead and remove the 4 bolts. It's a 13mm is what it is, and we'll go ahead and remove them. We want to make sure that we retain the 4 bolts before we reinstall it back onto the vehicle. What we're doing here is we're going to be prepping the front of the vehicle to accept the winch assembly. Before we remove the front lower bumper cover here, you can remove the front grille assembly. It just makes things a little easier. There's a little tab on the front here. You just pull down on it and pull forward on the grille. You don't have to do that, but it makes it easier. Otherwise, the grille will actually catch on the front of the vehicle here. So we'll go ahead and finish removing these 2 last bolts here on the front bumper cover. And once those are removed, the front bumper cover will come away from the vehicle, just like that. So with the lower front bumper removed from the vehicle, we're going to remove the winch cover here. The winch cover is just held in place by 2 plastic rivets. So we're actually going to go ahead and remove those 2 rivets and this front grille portion. With the winch installed on the vehicle, you actually will not need to keep this piece. Little suggestion, I would probably keep it just in case you decide down the road to actually put the vehicle back together without the winch. That way you have it. So go ahead and remove that last rivet here. And that grille just tips forward, and there's 2 locking tabs in the back that tip out. So the front bumper cover is ready to accept the winch. So before we install the winch onto the vehicle, there's a few precautions we want to take here. We want to ensure that our routing for our cables going to our winch contactor are shown like this. There's a picture in the instructions that also shows this setup here too. But the routing has to be this direction. If we don't have it this way, we're going to be short on the wiring going to the contactor and to the power supply onto the vehicle. Also, the vehicles sometimes are equipped with additional zip ties on here, like this one is shown. We want to get rid of those zip ties and discard of them. That way we can get the winch contactor wiring free. There might be another one up here. The only one that's going to stay in place here are the ones that are wrapped around the blue and the yellow cable. Leave that zip tie in place. We don't need to cut that one. So we're ready to install the winch onto the vehicle. So before we install the winch assembly onto the vehicle here, an added note that's kind of a little nice tip to know is before we install this, if your vehicle has a fair amount of hours on it or a lot of miles and you're kind of getting close to that service recommendation limit, you do want to change the fluid now, because once the winch is installed, it's nearly impossible to get actually to the fill plug on the front gear case. So refer to your owner's manual or your service manual for the proper fluid and the capacity of the front gear case. So we're going to go ahead and install the winch assembly onto the chassis here. So there's actually 4 fasteners that actually secure the winch assembly to the chassis of the vehicle. Our chassis points are going to be here, 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 and here, and those are going to be used with these fasteners, and they're going to screw into these points on the winch itself. So we're going to go ahead and lift the winch up into the chassis here. So before I do that, I just want to point out we got our red and black battery cables here. We want to make sure those are routed. There's a little rolled edge here in the frame. That's where both these cables are going to be routed through. So we want to make sure we get them into that location when we're lifting this winch up into place. If we don't do that, we will not be able to get the winch in place. And then make sure you kind of got the contactor wiring out of the way as you're lifting it in there. And we're going to roll the winch into place. And I'm just going to use an alignment punch to get one hole started. And that also helps by holding the winch in place. And then we can go ahead and start getting our fastener started into the winch. So we got our 4 bolts started on our winch here. So there's one upper and then one lower. Just as an added tip, what I did is I used the punch to get one side of the one upper bolt on one side of the winch, and then I went ahead and started the lower bolts first. That way the winch will just rock up into place. When you're doing that, you need to be positive that you're not pinching any of the cables going to the winch itself. So that's going to be the red cable, the black cable, the yellow, or the blue. You may need to kind of reach your finger in here and kind of pull these cables back to get enough clearance to roll that winch up into place to get the 2 upper bolts started. So once they're started, we can go ahead and tighten those down to torque specifications. And then we're done with that installation, and then we can go ahead and route the battery cables up to the battery. So I went ahead and ran the winch battery cables up to the battery, the black cable and the red cable. You'll notice that the cables are routing down behind the cooling fan itself, and it pops up just in front of the battery itself. So the cables are sitting up here. We're not going to attach them yet to the battery, but they are routed in place currently and awaiting to be connected. So our next step here is we're actually going to locate the contactor connector on the main harness. It'll probably be zip tied on the chassis frame here. There's a dust cap on this. We do want to remove the dust cap. Just take a little tiny pick, release the locking tab, and that'll release the dust cap. And in the kit itself, there's a splitter harness here that has 3 ends on it. And what we're actually going to do is we're only going to connect one of these ends from the chassis harness to our Y splitter. So we'll connect it here. This is the only connector we're going to hook up at this time. The winch kit that we're installing has an auto fairlead and a wireless remote. If you're installing a winch and you don't have the auto fairlead or the wireless remote, or you have a different setup altogether, make sure to refer to the instructions that are included with the winch. At the back of the instructions, there's 3 different options depending on what application you're using. So make sure you reference that when you're connecting it. So here's the splitter we just installed in the harness on our last step here. So our next step is we're actually going to install the control box and connect up the wiring to this. So on our splitter itself, the end right here, so here's kind of the Y harness or where it splits off. This connector here is going to connect into our control box wiring right here. So here's our control box on my left hand here, and we're going after this connector right here, and we're going to go ahead and connect those. Again, just as a reminder, your installation instructions, you can reference the electrical connector pictures in the back of the instructions. Our control box here is going to be mounted to the frame just behind the cooling fan again. We'll probably mount it on this on this frame mount right here, just zip tie it out of the way. What we're going to do next, though, before we mount that control box, is we're going to want to run our wiring, our power wiring, from our control box up to the battery. So on the connector here, we got 2 wires. We got a black wire with a ring terminal, and then we have an orange wire with the spade connector on there. The spade connector is actually going to connect to a connector on the harness, which we'll show you here in a second. And the black ring terminal will actually connect to the battery negative post. We are not connecting these up right now. We're just going to route them up there and get them in position. And then towards the end, we'll go ahead and connect everything up. So I'm going to route this wiring behind the cooling fan. I'm just going to follow kind of the same route that the main harness is taken. And it doesn't take much. Just run it up like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and just kind of clean it up down here and mount my control box somewhere in this location. Just making sure that I don't zip tie the brake line and make sure the wiring routing looks nice and neat. So we're going to go ahead and mount the wireless remote receiver. The wireless remote receiver is going to mount right here on this piece of metal here that's coming off the shock mount, off the frame. It's going to be tucked up under here, just like this. Get it in there a little tighter. And what we're going to do is we're going to hold that in position with the supplied zip ties. So we'll run them through the hole of the wireless receiver, and then we'll zip tie it to the frame there, and then we'll go ahead and route our wiring appropriately and zip tie those back here. So we'll go ahead and take care of that. So we have the wireless remote receiver mounted to the frame here, and then we have the wiring also right here. So we got our orange wire and our black wire. I'm going to go ahead and route those wires under the front frame here and just route them up to the battery. Then we'll lay that over the battery for our other wires we need to connect up. And then we have our white connector that's coming off our wireless remote receiver here. That's going to connect to that Y splitter harness that we installed earlier. So we're going to want to make sure we connect those. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So the last connection coming off the control box here is going to our auto fair lead. So our auto fair lead connection's right here. I just routed it just underneath the radiator on top of the winch, routed it through. So we'll go ahead and make that connection. So with that connected, we're going to go ahead and just finish zip tying this last wiring up out of the way. Again, I know I've said this a few times, but want to make sure we don't zip tie the brake line itself. So we'll zip tie that out of the way. We'll cut our excess zip tie, and then we'll move on to the next steps. So we're going to go ahead and install the handlebar switch for the winch assembly. But first, we actually need to locate the harness that's part of the vehicle. This is the connector for the handlebar switch. There is a dust cap on here we'll have to remove. Just push down and release that dust cap. If you don't see your connector here, there is a possibility it might be underneath the handlebar pod here. Ours was zip tied right to the handlebars, right where it should be. So we're going to go ahead and mount our handlebar switch under the handlebar, and that gets mounted between the brake and the left-hand control here. We want to make sure our wiring is routed through this little slit on the switch. That way it doesn't get pinched, or you potentially could drive the screw into the wiring when you're putting this on there. I'm going to go ahead and install this on the handlebar. I'm going to run the wiring of this connector between the wiring on the left-hand control. I'm just going to run that down in between. So I went ahead and installed the handlebar switch onto the handlebars. Just an added note here, there's like a little recess here, a little tab that comes off the switch. That's going to be above the engine off run off switch, which is the red button here. So I want to make sure that's above, and want to make sure that switch is fully seated onto the handlebars. And then we're going to go ahead and install our cover on the back side. And then we're going to install that with the provided 2 T25 torque screws. Want to just pay attention that you're installing this cover on the back side of the switch correctly. So when we're installing these torque screws, we just want to make sure we install those snug. We don't want to over torque them because we are just going into plastic. And just one last verification, you always want to make sure that wire that we ran through that slit in that switch cover is not going to be pinched or anything like that between the connection points at the bottom. And ours is clear. So we're going to go ahead and install the last torque screw. You might have to rotate the switch down, maybe to get some access to that screw, to get the screw started. And then you can rotate the whole switch assembly into position where you want it. And again, just an added note, we want to make sure that little button, this little recess here, is above this on-off portion. So with the winch switch mounted to the handlebars, our last step here is just to go ahead and connect our wiring up. And then we'll go ahead and add one more zip tie here just to clean everything up. And that looks good. So the next step is we're going to go ahead and mount the wireless remote control holder. So the holder or the holster can be mounted in any desired location you'd like. Before drilling the holes to mount this, you want to ensure there's nothing behind it, not like a wiring harness or a fuel tank or anything else that's going to interfere with the screws. The screws that are provided in the kit are just torque screws, so we will just drill a pilot hole and mount it anywhere you'd like to mount it. So in our vehicle here, we're not going to mount it, and we're just actually going to put the holster and the remote in the front storage bin. So we're going to go ahead and reinstall the lower bumper cover here. I want to make sure we get that installed. That little cutout right here, got to make sure that's above our tow hook on the front of the vehicle, like it is. And we'll slide that back into place. And we'll go ahead and reinstall our four 13mm screws we took out earlier. And if you did have a bumper on here, we want to make sure you reinstall that at the same time here. So our vehicle is not equipped with the bumper, so we're just got the bumper cover. And our last step here is we're going to install the front grill back in there. Just going to make sure you get the locking tabs behind the front bumper assembly right here. Our front bumper cover, and then we latch it in place. Make sure she's in place. And she's in place, so we're good to go. So we're going to go ahead and connect our wiring up here. It looks like a lot of wiring here. It's not too difficult here, just to kind of point a few things out here. So our black cable and the red cable, these are the cables coming from our winch. The red cable here that I send my fingers here, and the other one that goes to the other end here, this is actually for our battery tender that's on this vehicle. We have our power cables from the vehicle we took off earlier. And then we have our ground cable, which is kind of tucked under here. And in addition to that, we actually have the wiring from our wireless controller and our control box. These actually got to be connected also. So the ring terminals are actually going to go to the black terminal on the battery, and these spade connectors or on the orange wires are going to connect to these connectors here on the main harness. What we'll have to do is we'll have to cut away the electrical tape here and just undo these wires from the harness. These are going to be orange with a white tracer on them. These are key switch power wires, and then one of your wires is actually going to have a little plastic protective sheath on there. We're going to have to carefully kind of cut that away. What we're going to do is we're going to expose the little spade terminal under there, which we're going to connect our wire to. So we're going to go ahead and just cut off a little bit of this extra protection there. And then we're going to go ahead and make our connections here. So one of these orange spade terminals is going to connect into one of these, and we'll just use this one. It does not matter which orange wire goes to which orange wire here. Just make sure you make the connection. And there's a little protective boot over this, so you're going to have to kind of contend with that to get that to slide over at the same time. That's connected. And then the other one here is going to connect to our other spade terminal here. And that'll connect up to there too. So as an added note, you could come back over these if you wanted to. You could put some heat shrink tubing on this if you wanted to, or go back over it with electrical tape. It's totally up to you. So we'll go ahead and finish making our connections here. So we'll connect our ring terminals to our negative ground cable. We'll hook up our chassis ground and our battery tender ground, and then we'll go ahead and we'll connect our positive cables back up. Again, as an added note, we always want to reconnect the red cables first, then the black cables last. All right, so we got our battery cables all connected up, and I just cleaned some of the wiring up here, just running some additional zip ties on here, make it look nice and neat. And we just want to make sure that's tucked down out of the way, because when we install our front storage bin, if you hit that, it's not going to be able to go down far enough to lock in our quarter turns. So those are in. So that's in place. Looks good. Everything's tight, zip tied out of the way. Go ahead and install our front storage bin here. And then push our quarter turns, turn them, push down on them and give them a turn. And those are latched. We can go ahead and shut our front storage bin and go ahead and lock our rubber latches. So to turn on the wireless remote, we need to hold down the power button at the bottom of the remote. Hold that down, and then the red light will illuminate, and now the remote is powered up, and then we can go ahead and operate the remote with the in and out function. To turn it off, it'll have an auto off, but if you want to turn it off manually, you just hold down the power button, and then the red light will go off, and it's shut off. So next we're going to go ahead and just make sure to test the winch operation here. So I have the spool set into rope recovery, which is the H setting on the side of the spool. And I turned on the remote here. I'm just going to go ahead and walk this rope out with the remote. Push the out button. And check the in function. And we're also going to check it one more time, but we're going to run it in and hold the button down and make sure the auto stop fair lead is working properly. And it does. And I'm going to reach up on the handlebar here, and we're going to go ahead and run it out with the handlebar switch and run it back in. That's working properly also. So we'll go ahead and go to the L setting, which is the pull setting. So we'll rotate the spool to L. So L is going to be a pull setting also. So we'll run this back out. Now this setting is more if you're trying to pull yourself out or your buddy. So go back in. It's working there. Check the handlebar. Out. In function. And our last setting is going to be the freeze spool, which will be the N on the knob. And that one is just for you to pull out the winch. And that works properly. We'll go ahead and turn that winch dial back on to the rope recovery. So that's the faster setting. And our winch works properly. The installation is complete. So this concludes installation of the winch on this 2017 Sportsman XP1000. For additional information on accessories or parts or winches, please visit your local dealer or visit polaris.com/winches.